Good evening and thank you for joining us in this live session. Today we're with Eric Clifford Graff, Professor of Literature at Universidad Francisco Marroquín. Eric has a PhD in Spanish language and literature from the University of Virginia. He specialized in medieval and early modern Spain, the history of the novel, Renaissance studies, and literary, political, cultural, and economic theory. In addition to numerous academic essays on the poetry, theater, and narrative of Miguel de Cervantes, he has also published the book Cervantes and Modernity. Hello, Eric.
Hi, Javier. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Excellent.
Excited to be here today.
Great. This is going to be fun. Javier is our new moderator for our new setup here at the brand new film school of the University of Francisco Marroquín. We have changed the format slightly for this live session. We're going to have a conversation about the novel. We welcome your questions. As usual, please text them in the empty box to the right on YouTube or below if you are using the website of the course. Javier is our moderator, as I said. He is a graduate of the University of Francisco Marroquín. He is now the communications director of the new film school at the University of Francisco Marroquín. He's a graduate also of the college, Michael Palangi College, which specializes in liberal arts. Hence, we have chosen him for this live session. This is the second live session for the English speakers of the English part of the course. We are in the second module now. Students have read or studied between chapters 15 and chapters 25. The entire second module includes up to chapter 29. So we'll start with a brief review of what we've read so far, and then we will go straight to questions and a conversation. So please participate. Please enter your questions now. Now would be the time to take advantage of our open text space. Okay, so chapter 15 starts with the hilarious episode of the Anguessan mares. You recall that Don Quixote defended the beautiful Marcela's right to live alone in isolation and not be bothered by the infinite number of lovers that have been pursuing her in the Sierra Morena. And then, laughably, Don Quixote actually pursues her into the Sierra Morena. He doesn't find her, but they do have this episode with the mares where Rocinante actually has a attack of sexual adventurousness. After they are defeated by the Anguessan herders, we have the arrival at the second inn, which then leads to the hilarious episode of Maritornes and the manteamiento, the blanketing of Sancho, which is then followed by the episode of the herds of sheep and the flocks of sheep, I guess they're called in English. Then we have the men dressed in white, the procession, the episode of the dead body, the adventure of the dead body, followed by the Fulling Mills episode. Then the discovery, or actually robbery, of the helmet of Mambrino, at which point our heroes come across a group of galley slaves who are going to row in the king's galleys in the Mediterranean. Don Quixote liberates them. They turn on him, and then our heroes have to take refuge in the Sierra Morena because they are now technically fugitives from the law. They have freed the king's prisoners. So
Wonderful.
We'll take it up there.
Cool, and we already have our first question, which is from Mary. And she's asking, through the character of Don Quixote, does Cervantes defend or mock religion? Wow. There's a moment after the battle where Don Quixote sees the sheep and then tells Sancho that, quote, one of the effects of fear is to cloud the senses and make things appear other than they are. End quote.
Wow.
Again, is this meant to be a pun, or is he asking Sancho to make sacrifices based on blind faith? And to Mary, this all sounds pretty religious. So she's saying that all of this is getting them both beat up What would you say to that? And what do you think Cervantes' point is with this chapter?
That's a fantastic question. If I've understood it correctly, she's asking if somehow this dynamic of the illusions versus the prosaic reality that is at the heart of the novel has something to do with a critique of religion. And I think that's spot on. That's a terrific insight and observation. And I hadn't thought before of the episode of the sheep as a possible allusion to some sort of ritualized sacrifice, but that's certainly there. I've traditionally read the episode of the sheep as an allusion to Achilles' famous battle where Achilles wants Hector's, I believe it's Hector's arms, and when those arms are awarded to Odysseus, Achilles slaughters a flock of sheep in his rage, which the gods make him think are his rivals. But if we think deep enough about even that episode from the Homeric myth, slaughtering sheep is certainly part of ancient ritualized form of religion and sacrifice. So I think Mary is spot on. And then that, of course, complements perfectly all the other episodes that we've seen up to now that are clearly criticisms of religion. I think we need to distinguish between a criticism of formal religion or religious hierarchy or a power structure based on religion, such as the church, and religious thinking or belief in some sort of metaphysical reality or belief in God or simply faith, right? But Cervantes is certainly questioning our definition of religion and asking us to criticize religion. And Sancho, I'm sorry, I'm not remembering entirely her question, but this is terrific that Mary has actually quoted from the text in her question. I think she already knows the answer. But Sancho once asked Don Quixote if it's an illusion.
Well, she's saying that Don Quixote tells Sancho after the imagery over the battle that Don Quixote is describing.
Okay.
Then he gives this quote on fear. And I'm going to just read it once again, which is, one of the effects of fear is to cloud the senses and make things appear other than they are.
Terrific. So she's focused in not only on the classic response of Don Quixote to, the classic response of Don Quixote to Sancho, which is to say you're not seeing reality. Reality is clouded for you. But she's also focusing in on that issue of fear, whether or not religion is the way human beings compensate or somehow repress our fear of the natural world or the unknown. I think that's terrific. I think you're spot on, Mary. Please let us know if you find that answer satisfactory. I think that's a terrific question and a terrific way of thinking about the novel.
Great. And the next question goes on to one of the suggested readings on Lazarillo de Tormes. So perhaps before we go into it, you can just briefly describe what that is.
What is Lazarillo de Tormes?
Yeah.
The Lazarillo of Tormes is widely considered the first modern picaresque novel. It's a series of episodes involving Lazarillo or Lazarus, who is reflecting on his life and apparently confessing to someone. There's some religious authority who's asking him to give a testimony about his life, and he tells a series of episodes. It's a very raunchy, very materialistic. There's a lot of sex. There's a lot of emphasis on the body. And it's a satire as well. And many people consider that the origins of modern fiction. And it's certainly important for reading Don Quixote. Cervantes alludes to Lazarillo de Tormes explicitly throughout in the opening set of poems to part one. The character Ginés de Pasamonte in the Galeotes episode actually alludes directly to Lazarillo de Tormes. He says he's writing a novel and it will compete with and be better than the Lazarillo de Tormes. So it's clearly a very important novel for understanding Don Quixote, the history of literature, and it's also clearly consciously alluded to and referenced by Cervantes.
He then asks about Lazarillo.
Who is asking?
This is anonymous.
Anonymous.
Yeah.
Anonymous. Please let us know where you're from, Anonymous.
And well, regarding that, he's just asking if Lazarillo, well, he goes through several masters, as you've just described, to survive, basically. And he's just wondering whether he would have been better off on his own. And what do you think about that? And what was really the point of putting himself through all of those difficult experiences?
So Anonymous is asking me to speculate on whether Lazarillo would have been
Right.
better off on his own. I would say not, because then we wouldn't have a novel. That would be very bad. I assume that's a question that cuts to the issue of the novel itself. Since he's going through a series of masters, that whole master-servant or master-slave relationship is being questioned and is at issue. We are social creatures. We don't live on islands by ourselves, so it's impossible to completely exempt oneself from interacting with other people. But I assume that's a question that cuts to the philosophy of the novel. It's a little bit beyond my ability to answer hypothetically. What was the second part of the question?
Well, what was the point of putting himself through all of these experiences?
Well, he doesn't necessarily put himself through them. He's very poor. His mother is worried about him and gives him to his first master as a way of feeding him. So on some level, we're talking about a desperate reaction to very desperate circumstances that require Lazarillo to have a series of masters. He's seeking protection and something along the lines of modern employment. We're actually in that transition between a feudal system in which relationships between human beings are organic and we're part of our master's family somehow, and a modern world in which we are employees, right? So the novel is on the cusp of that transition. So that last part's a very good question. What's the point of putting himself through all of this? In some sense, it's life. In another sense, in a broader sense, it's about the modern world, the modern material and commercial world that is being born here, right? This is the origin of modern petit bourgeois capitalism, if you wish, to borrow Marxian terms.
We just got in a question from Margaret from Minnesota. So hi, Margaret.
Wow.
Thank you.
Hi, Margaret.
And she's asking, based on her previous question, are white sheep symbols of a group of people?
That's a really good question. I would assume that sacrificial ritual, I'm using, I guess, the theorist René Girard, the late great anthropologist. I believe he died in November of last year. Ritualized sacrifice always involves substituting animals for people. You see this in Christian myth, right? The Lamb of God. Jesus himself is considered a lamb in some representations. So the slaughtering of all those sheep, I mean, Don Quixote himself thinks that they are an army of people, so I think you're on the right track. What to make of that, I'm not sure. Please let us know what you think. Margaret, was it?
Yes.
Margaret in Minnesota. I'd be curious, who do you think the sheep, or whom do you think the sheep represent?
Now we have one from Tracy Marks. And she's asking, when Don Quixote frees the galley slaves, do you think that Cervantes is taking the role of Don Quixote and objecting to such punishment in general? Or just very harsh punishment for minor crimes?
Wow. A lot of these questions go to the issue of Cervantes' intention. I think that's really hard, but if I'm forced to answer the question, I do think Cervantes is critical of the justice system of the time. Whether or not he objects to punishment generally, as we do in the United States today, for example, where we encourage our children to wear bicycle helmets before they go to bed because we're so worried about people being injured or harmed. I'm not sure Cervantes is that modern, so modern that he would object to punishment per se. but there is something deeply disturbing about the degree to which these men are basically given death sentences because 4 to 5 years rowing in the galleys is not good. Your odds of surviving that are very slim, and to be sentenced to something that harsh for sleeping with your cousin or having stolen some shirts is pretty serious. So I think that's, I think you're on to the issue of, I'm sorry, what was her last name was Marks. I got that.
Yeah, Tracy Marks
Tracy.
from Arlington, Massachusetts.
From Arlington, Massachusetts. Tracy, I think you're on to the issue of justice. What is it? But notice that the spectrum. Ginés de Pasamonte is apparently a very dangerous, evil individual to the degree that the guards themselves are terrified of him. So we have this extreme of someone who's clearly very bad, and then this other extreme of very minor, pathetic crimes. In fact, one man's going to the galleys for being a pimp, which may sound bad, but it's interesting that Don Quixote says pimps should be made admirals of the king's fleet, practically. So Don Quixote and probably Cervantes does not think that that particular profession deserves a death sentence. But that range of crimes that are all being punished in this way, I think you're onto something. There is a sort of a casuistic problematizing of what crime is and how the state should respond and what justice is and when is justice too harsh. I think you're onto something. And if you read the second part of the novel, Tracy, Ginés de Pasamonte will reappear, and I'm not sure he's as malevolent in part 2 as he is in part 1, which might question even the nature of punishment of really guilty people. So, great question.
Do you see any of this going on today?
Do I see any of this particular?
I mean, not the exact same case, but this misproportion of punishment of the law for certain actions.
Sure. I think right now in the United States there is an ongoing debate. In my personal view, it's taking far too long to decriminalize the use of drugs. The idea that someone is incarcerated in a prison for putting something in their body strikes me personally as repugnant, and I know that's a major issue in the American political discourse today, so very much so. It is very much applicable to the here and now. So thank you. Was that also Tracy's question, or was that your intervention?
That was my intervention.
Okay, Javier.
You caught me. I hope I don't get incarcerated. But now we have one from Dwight G. Dwight G. from Morgan Hill, California.
Okay.
And he says, I enjoy the distance the narrator takes from the story. Calling up Unamuno, the characters are more real than the author. I'd love to hear your thoughts on manipulations C takes to achieve this. Cervantes takes to achieve this.
My thoughts on the manipulations on how Cervantes achieves this. I think that's a great question. A lot of these questions, that one in particular, these are potential topics for graduate thesis, right? Master's degree thesis. At the very least, a very interesting study or paper. What narrative techniques does Cervantes use to achieve this distancing effect between the narrator and his characters? Wow. I mean, one thing that occurs is that before we answer that question, we should probably point out that there are multiple layers of narrators. So one way to create distance between the narrator and the characters, it seems to me, is to create more narrators. If there's a narrator and a translator and another narrator between the first narrator and everything that follows, then you've automatically created this buffer, this sort of mise en abîme is the French term, the Chinese box or Russian doll-like effect where Different narrators occupy different spaces in the narrative frame before we actually get to the story. So allowing different narrators to intrude, allowing different characters to intrude and comment on their narrators. And then I guess another thing I would point out, this is, again, I think that's a great question. We could go on forever, but it's interesting sometimes the way at the beginning of chapters or in particular moments of high tension, the narrative voice intrudes and addresses directly the reader. I think that's a big part of what makes Cervantes' style so unique and recognizable and playful. You'll have a long intervention on the part of Cide Hamete, and you'll have another narrator stating that Cide Hamete says the following, and then we'll get a long quote, 2 or 3 paragraphs from Cide Hamete, in which he laments some topic. And I think that's, again, a very postmodern style in a way, even though it's Renaissance. And it certainly makes us conscious of the fact suddenly that we're reading fiction and that there is quite a bit of distance between ourselves and those characters. That's a terrific question.
Tracy Marks again asking
Excellent.
on the question regarding the slaves, the galley slaves, and she's saying, or does Don Quixote think the go-between is a matchmaker rather than a pimp?
Wow.
Maybe he's too naive to even know what a pimp is.
Wow, I hadn't thought of that last part. I certainly think if we look at part 1 in particular, the role of love and desire and sexuality as somehow bridging cultures, somehow transcending different castes, is a big part of Cervantes' program. So I think you're onto something. Somehow Don Quixote's defense of the pimp accords with Cervantes' view of love more generally. So whether Don Quixote's too naive to even understand what a pimp is, or perhaps he's even voicing Cervantes' opinion that technically there can be no such thing as a pimp in a negative sense. It's just a matchmaker. This is somebody who brings 2 souls together. Again, I think you're putting your finger on what makes Cervantes so unique. Don Quixote could be incredibly naive and incredibly insightful at the same time. We've had a lot of questions about Don Quixote being an intelligent, insane character at the same time. I think, Tracy, you're putting your finger right on an instance where Cervantes seems to be saying something about Don Quixote's naivete, which, upon reflection, sounds like a pretty sophisticated criticism of the legal system.
She's saying again that my above question refers to Professor Graff's comment that Don Quixote seems to approve of the go-between. Is that the case?
I was simply offering my opinion. I think if you read the passage, Don Quixote clearly approves of the go-between. Then the question becomes, is Cervantes signaling something to us or not? And I would tend to think yes, because of the broader way that love and attraction is considered a positive force throughout the novel. I hope that answers the question.
There were many questions regarding the drawings that people find on the page, particularly this one. If you can see it well right there, or we can put it on the screen. So Jose is asking, before we get into the questions, I'd like to hear from you. Can you tell us a bit about the creative process of what went into making these drawings?
Okay, this is the episode of the fulling mills, right? With Sancho doing his business right here in the middle, Don Quixote on top. The process here is that I have a friend who is an artist, I think brilliant, very talented, and we have brief conversations about how a particular episode might be represented, and then he does his own thing. So I have very little input. I tend to try and talk Chris Roloffs, that's his name. He's from Keene, Virginia. I usually have a series of episodes that I try to talk Chris into illustrating, and he makes his own decisions about whether or not he wants to and exactly how to illustrate him. This one is particularly Dantesque in the way he's represented the forest. Chris is also a student of graphic arts, so he's very familiar with famous illustrators of famous texts. Here he's told me he's alluding to Gustave Doré's drawings, engravings, not only for Cervantes, but also for Dante's Inferno.
This picture shows not only how Sancho is squatting
Yes.
or reacting to the sound of the machine in the forest, but also the issue of hierarchy. He's saying Don Quixote is on top of a horse, whereas Sancho is against Don Quixote's legs, squatting towards the ground. His question is, what did the artist want to convey with the windmill? And it was stated that this was the second machine, but there will be a connection. Will there be a connection between all of them?
Whose question is this?
This is Jose's question.
Jose from...
He didn't
tell us. Jose from Anonymous Land.
Yeah.
Well, you would have to ask Chris about what he has in mind with the mills. It is a different kind of mill, so he's put the windmill in here clearly to connect the two machines, the two episodes. I think one could read Don Quixote as a series of medications, a series of meditations on machines, inventions. At the time, we have several. We have the windmill, we have the fulling mills, we have the printing press in part 2, we have a water wheel, all kinds of machines, ships, modern technology. Don Quixote talks about the invention of gunpowder, for example. So technology is certainly an issue, and I think it would be difficult to separate two different types of mills. So my answer to the second part of the question would be yes, I think they are related. And what was the first part of the question? What's he doing with the windmill? I guess he's just reminding us that this is a different kind of mill. I think Jose, you've really put your finger on something when you talk about hierarchy. Remember, this is the same episode where Sancho eventually asks for a salary. So we really are assessing, I guess, under a microscope here, the relationship between the feudal lord and his serf or his servant. And they're very intimately, they're very close. I mean, Sancho does his business actually while he's grasping Don Quixote's saddle. He has his leg pressed against his chest. They seem to be almost fused together, and yet it's a very uncomfortable episode. Don Quixote, I believe, pinches his nostrils and says, "Sancho, I think you're very afraid." And then they have a very long discussion about a salary, and there's actually some violence where Don Quixote actually strikes Sancho with his lance about his back. So that hierarchy and what it's based on, and whether or not it's still viable in the modern world, is very much at issue.
For those of you who are just connecting right now, I just want to say you can go to donquixote.ufm.edu and remember to subscribe to our channel and watch the rest of our videos. This is a live session pertaining to one of the segments, and it's a very rich course by Professor Graf. Highly recommended to everyone. Let's go back to the images.
Okay.
And as we were speaking about, there's a lot of meaning that people can find in these particular images. We were just talking about hierarchy and Don Quixote and how there's a Dantesque sort of feel to the whole forest behind. Now we have a question from Maggie on this image, and she's asking, what is the meaning of the humanoid trees in the illustration? Why do they look at Sancho and Don Quixote somewhat horrified?
Yeah, but I don't know. Again, it's difficult enough to ask me what Cervantes is up to, something I've studied all my life, and I'm still not sure about answering. This is an artist's decision rendering. So all I know is there is some allusion here to a certain circle in hell where the souls are parts of trees. But beyond that, you've really got me. That would be up to you. I'd be interested to know what you think, actually. That's a great question.
It was Maggie, and she's also asking about other images, which I think have she's added a very interesting contribution and a very interesting read of them. Perhaps you hadn't considered them, or other people haven't considered them. If we go to this one, can you all see it right there? She says, the illustration shows Don Quixote on Rocinante, the horse, waving both of the barber's basin in one hand and his sword in the other. The barber and the other horse is mystified by Don Quixote's taking the basin. Sancho's donkey is in the background while he appears to be about to trip on the road. A frog or toad seems to be watching Sancho. Swirling in the foliage is some kind of animal, like a wolf or wild pig. In the clouds there seems to be a shape of a dragon or a snake. Why is Don Quixote so jubilant, and why is Sancho looking back and not where he's going?
This is whom again?
This is Maggie.
Maggie. Maggie, I think this is the barber, and this is Sancho. Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing.
Let me hold this for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure this is the barber, and this is Sancho, who's contemplating the barber's ass. So Don Quixote's one Mambrino's helmet, which of course we know is a barber's basin, and the barber is running away. However, you're right, he does look very much like Sancho, so perhaps the artist is saying that Sancho and the barber are similar or interchangeable. What was the other aspect of the question? She noted the dragon, she noted the figure.
Why is he looking back? Why is Sancho looking back?
I think he's looking back, and he's looking, it appears to me he's looking back at the basin in particular. This is just my personal response. He's upset. That's his new barber. That's his new basin. That's his stuff. And Don Quixote has taken his stuff. Why is Don Quixote so jubilant? According to the novel, Don Quixote thinks he has won a magical helmet that has mystical powers, right? It's also a victory. We've seen a lot of cases in which Don Quixote gets defeated horribly, right? He's unhorsed, he's beaten, he's milled, he's thrashed routinely. For once in the novel, he is victorious. I say victorious in quotation marks. He did attack an innocent barber and steal his stuff, so I don't know if we should be as celebratory as Don Quixote is.
Regarding Sancho now, Jose asked, did he believe he would get paid for going on the journey? Like, would he get the island? Or was he trying to arrange some sort of contract? And how did people deal with, were they even called contracts in the past? How did they make these kind of formal arrangements or informal?
Jose, that's a terrific question. It goes right to one of the major issues of the novel. I would recommend Carol Johnson's book, Cervantes and the Material World, which talks quite a bit about this issue of Sancho's salary, the relationship between Sancho and Don Quixote. It appears in chapter 7, I believe, when Sancho first appears, that Don Quixote does promise him an island. So that is a reference to the relationship between a chivalric knight and his squire, a medieval relationship. But we'll see over the course of the novel, and we see in the Fulling Mills episode, Sancho's also interested in getting paid. He's interested in an actual fixed salary, un salario conocido, I believe. A known rate is what he wants, something that would pay him monthly. If you recall, we also have the same problem in the episode of Andrés and Juan Aldudo, the rich peasant who's beating Andrés for having lost some sheep at some point. So this issue of pay for services, pay for work, is a huge part of the novel. Exactly whether or not people signed contracts and had them notarized and things like that, I would think that they did. There were notaries at the time. This is a very bureaucratic period. Things need to be sealed and signed and notarized for just about every aspect of life at that point in time, but I assume people could also reach their own freely agreed to informal arrangements. There's always an informal economy, right? So that's a really good question. I would pay attention to that as I read the novel, see how that relationship between Sancho and Don Quixote evolves. But Jose, you're spot on. You're on a very important theme of the novel.
Dwight G. from Morgan Hill, California says, Ginés de Pasamonte shows up in this section.
Right.
A conman and an author of picaresque books. I know this is getting ahead, he says. He reappears in part 2, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this character.
Ginés de Pasamonte is a very important character. He's one of the few characters. There's Don Quixote and Sancho, of course, also the housekeeper and his niece, Sancho's wife. But other than that, Ginés de Pasamonte, I believe, is the only character, well, the priest and the barber as well. Other than that group, Ginés de Pasamonte is the only character who reappears in part 2. He's in both parts. So he's clearly important. There's a Professor Riquer who's written a very important book on Cervantes in which he argues that this is a character based on an actual historical figure with whom Cervantes had a very personal rivalry. In fact, he thinks that the man that Ginés de Pasamonte represents might have been the apocryphal author, the Avellaneda author of the illegitimate part 2 of Don Quixote. That seems to me slightly reductionist. He's also a fictional character and very interesting. The way he evolves from a picaresque, criminal-like character in part 1 to a man who puts on a puppet show and has apparently trained a monkey to perform tricks in part 2. He seems almost like a redeemed character somehow. I think that's a very interesting question, and it calls up all kinds of issues. I would simply point out that Ginés de Pasamonte is given a certain amount of power in part 2. If in part 1 he's the man who's most enchained and most repressed, in part 2 he's almost at the level of Cervantes himself. He's a creator, he's an artist. He puts on a puppet show that actually induces Don Quixote into attacking the figures. So he's almost gone from the level of the most depressed, enslaved, punished character to someone on the order of Cervantes himself, an artist, a creator, a master of illusions.
And for those who have enrolled in the course, you'll probably hear more about Ginés de Pasamonte as you keep on working through the modules. I want to give a shout out again to the MOOC. You guys can enroll at donquixote.ufm.edu. As some of you might know, Barbara Oakley visited a couple of weeks ago, and she actually loved what we were doing down here. And she said she has seen few works like this one. I think that's a great honor to hear that from someone like her.
Yeah.
So please subscribe to her channel or watch the rest of her videos, and
recommend us to friends, anyone you think that might be
keep the discussion going. Let's keep the questions going. This one's a very interesting one and quite elaborate. And this one refers to this particular drawing.
Okay, I'll hold it, you read.
Yeah. So she says, this is Maggie. After the battle with the sheep and goats, which Don Quixote thought that they were human enemies and wanted to protect the weak against them, Sancho thought Don Quixote was vomiting blood and leaned over thinking his master was dying. Actually, it was the balm they had drunk to help them in battle.
Right.
The picture illustrates just when Sancho smelled Don Quixote's vomit. Sancho vomited the bomb he had drunk back on Don Quixote, a battle of bombs, so to speak. She thinks that this depicts a weird baptism, where the healing balm is sprayed on each other, a battle, and yet an exchange of bodily fluids as well. She suggests it is similar to the ancient ritual of exchanging blood as a covenant between two friends,
Wow.
because Sancho thinks that Don Quixote is really spewing out blood. And perhaps this is the beginning of a new relationship between them. Sancho wants to leave this madman, Hidalgo, but now he has bonded with him even more closely. That's Maggie's read, which we find fascinating.
Wow, Maggie.
And
Impressive.
she asked, so will Sancho continue questioning Don Quixote's sanity, or will he think more like Don Quixote by the end of the book?
Well, Maggie, you don't really want me to tell you the answer to that. I think that's a terrific reading, that this is somehow ritualistic. It's right after another ritualistic episode with this slaughtering, this allusion to some sort of sacrifice. Was it Maggie who brought that up in the first place?
Yeah.
Earlier on. I think that would be very interesting to read about, Maggie. I look forward to your explanation of, first of all, the origins of this ritual of exchanging blood or exchanging bodily fluids as a way of bonding. I think that would be very interesting to read about as a sort of anthropological context for what might be happening in this episode. But it's clearly, in terms of literature, it's very innovative stuff. I haven't heard or cannot recall of another text in which two characters vomit on each other. I think we see all kinds of exchanges in Dante. There's characters that turn into each other, that metamorphose into each other. And that's always been the direction that I've gone with this episode, that they are somehow, they are baptizing each other, they are becoming each other. It's also really funny and raunchy. It reminds me of a famous episode of Family Guy where everyone vomits. Vomiting is hilarious, right? But I think you're right. There's something ritualistic going on here. And they do bond, and it does occur at a moment where Sancho is seriously considering breaking things off and leaving his master behind because he's shown himself again to be a complete madman. That's a really interesting and subtle interpretation, and I'm glad you are reading it at that level. That's the level that it should be read at, Maggie.
I've particularly enjoyed that in this session, how people are not just sticking to the text, but they're going beyond and seeing all of the different elements that the MOOC offers. Mm-hmm. So to start wrapping things up, I'd like to hear from you some last thoughts on these section.
We're in the middle of the novel. We're in the heart of the novel. After this, we will get a couple of interpolated novels, so narrative experiments and a lot of literary theory towards the end. But what happens in the Sierra Morena really is, I think, the center of the novel in many respects. So I think readers, students, I would ask you what you think this core, this heart of the novel is telling us, and perhaps even what the symbolism, a lot of time is spent at an inn, and a lot of time is spent in the Sierra Morena, doing penance, encountering other characters. So I've always thought that the inn itself and the Sierra Morena are two major symbols, and I'd be really interested in hearing what you think those two symbols could possibly mean.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for having me here tonight. I really enjoyed exploring this element and being here tonight with you, asking these questions.
Terrific.
And seeing how rich of a global discussion this is becoming.
These are amazing questions. Please keep them coming. I am very impressed. I love these sessions because I always leave with my head spinning, and they force me to think about the novel in ways that I haven't myself. And I think that's the most exciting part about the course. And thank you. That was a lot of fun.
That was, and to everyone watching, thank you again for joining us tonight. Keep sending your question. That only makes the discussion even richer. donquixote.ufm.edu. Remember to sign up, subscribe to our channel, and keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Adios.